Good evening. The regular meeting of the Southern Shores Towns Council for October the 3rd, 2017 is now in session. I'd ask you to join me in the Pledge of Allegiance, if you would. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. There's no shortage of people who need our thoughts and prayers to be with them this day. From the many hundreds killed or injured in a vicious attack in Las Vegas, to the many thousands whose lives have been turned upside down in Puerto Rico and other places in the islands. Not to mention the people of Texas and Florida, who were also devastated by major storm events. We were very fortunate to have dodged a bullet, if you know what I mean. Please join me in a moment of reflection and concern and prayer for all these people. Thank you. Thank you. Council, we need a motion to approve the agenda.
So moved.
Have a second, Gary? All in favor?
Aye.
Council, agenda's been approved for tonight's meeting. Thank you. Need a motion, Council, to approve the consent agenda, tab 1 in your book. Do I have such a motion?
So moved.
Thank you, Leo. Second? Go ahead. All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. The consent agenda has been approved for tonight's meeting. This time, I'd like to ask David Cole to take over the meeting for a minute with employee recognition. I'm going to join David down there.
Mayor, members of council, thank you for allowing us to take this quick opportunity to express our sincere appreciation to Officer Ryan Jones on receiving his advanced law enforcement certificate. Just to give you a little bit of background, this award is issued by the North Carolina Criminal Justice Education and Training Standards Commission. In order to obtain this specific certification, Senior Officer Jones, who's too young to be called a senior officer anywhere, had to obtain the following before he was even eligible, let alone certified. You have to obtain a graduate or a professional degree issued by an academic institution. Officer Jones has a master's degree in resource management and federal law enforcement. Had to accumulate 320 hours of law enforcement training. Some of those classes that he did attend were crime scene technology and evidence collection, criminal investigations, interview and interrogation process, narcotics investigations, solo active shooter response, and the Police Law Institute. He also has to have at least 4 years of experience as a law enforcement officer. Ryan has been with the Town of Southern Shores Police Department since June of 2013. Ryan moved to the Outer Banks in 2012 from Pittsburgh area, where he attended Slippery Rock University. He obtained a bachelor's degree and then went on to obtain his master's degree, again in resource management and federal law enforcement. And again, 2013, he was employed by the town, and he is currently serving as a senior officer. Ryan is also a certified emergency medical technician. And in his spare time, which I find hard to believe that he has, because Ryan and his wife, like Caitlin, they enjoy kayaking and camping, but in July, they expanded their family with 2 twin daughters. So I don't know about the spare time. But I would like to congratulate Officer Jones on obtaining this advanced certification. Mayor, please. Thank you.
We are so fortunate to have the people we have in our police department and our fire department. We are so blessed, I think is the way to say it. I thank all of them for their service to our town. Special request to council, Madera County League of Women's Voters to expend town funds to video candidates. Is there anybody from the league who would like to speak to this? If not, council, I'd entertain a motion to authorize this expenditure.
How much is the expenditure? Do we know?
Peter, I think you know the answer to that.
Yes, we had estimated it would be somewhere, probably not over $500. So about 3.5 hours of services by the videographer.
Thank you.
Let me ask the question. Is our video guy, is he the one that's going to do it?
He would be the one, if he's available, he would be the one to do it. Yes, sir.
Okay, and using our equipment, correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so how long you think it's going to take? 2.5 hours?
3.5.
Somewhere around 3.5 hours we
3.5.
take. They told us they were limiting the event to 2 hours max. So it would take some not editing, but put together time, downloading time, et cetera, for him. So we're just estimating somewhere not over $500.
Okay. Another advantage of doing this, I talked to Bobby Dobbs, who is the director of GovEd TV, and he said that other towns are, like Nags Head and Kill Devil Hills, are funding the videotaping, and he also said that he would run it on the government TV channel. So I think that's in the interest of the community. It's a good thing. So I'll make a motion that we go ahead and approve the request to fund the videotaping for the League of Women Voters candidate forum on
Thank you, Fred. Do you have a second?
October
Thank you,
11th.
Chris, second.
Okay. Yeah, it's going to run on October 20th at 9 p.m., October 27th at 2 p.m. and 9 p.m., and then again on Friday, November 3rd. There's the schedules for it.
Thank you, Leo.
Need a second?
I have a motion and a second. I know. All in favor, council?
Aye.
Aye. Motion's made and carried to fund the candidates forum. This time I'll call on Ms. Teresa Osborne for our annual audit presentation. Good evening.
Good
Evening,
evening.
Teresa.
How are y'all tonight?
Good, you
Good,
doing
thank you.
okay?
Good. I'm here with you tonight to present the results of your June 30th, 2017 independent audit, the audit of your financial statements. The town has received what's called an unmodified opinion on its financial statements, which is the best opinion you can receive, and that is outlined on pages 1 and 2 of your financial statements. This confirms that your financial statements are presented fairly in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles. Additionally, there were no significant deficiencies or material weaknesses noted in the financial statements, and that's a special, what we call an internal control report, and that's on pages 56 and 57 of the financial statements. I'm not going to review the entire report with you tonight, but I want to walk you through a few of what I consider to be the more important items in the financial statements. We report financial information in two ways. The first is what we refer to as fund financial statements, and these are the statements that are most routinely used by local governments. I'd like to draw your attention tonight to pages 14 and 15 of your financial statements. If you'll look on both of those pages, you'll see the first column on each page is headed with general fund. That's the major operating fund for the town, the general fund. Over on page 15, which is the statement of revenues, expenditures, and changes in fund balances, you'll see that total revenues exceeded expenses by $747,400. That's the third number up in the first column there from the bottom. The reason for this is that some revenues exceeded budget expectations and expenses were under budget in all departments. This gives you a total ending fund balance of $5,525,508. That's the number on the very bottom. I'd like to just don't confuse that number with undesignated or unassigned fund balance, because I'm going to be going there in just a minute to let you know what that is. The $5,526,508 is total fund balance. To talk about what the unassigned portion of that is, I'm going to go back over to page 14 in the first column. And you'll see that same number. At the bottom of that column, it says total fund balance is $5,526,508. The first thing that we have to do is when we get to June 30th, we have to break out that portion of total fund balance that is restricted in some manner. And there are a number of restrictions on your total fund balance. The largest restriction that you're going to see on the balance sheet is what we call stabilization by state statute. That's $1,667,644. That reference to stabilization by state statute is a statute that basically makes you restrict that portion of your fund balance that results from revenues that you've earned but you have not actually received at June 30th, 2017. That happens because you have things like a hurricane, Hurricane Matthew. You've earned the right to some FEMA reimbursements at June 30th, but you haven't actually gotten those at June 30th. You're actually still waiting for that particular reimbursement. Some other examples are things like occupancy tax and sales tax. You've actually earned the right to the May and the June distributions for those revenues, but you don't actually receive those until July, August, and September. So while they're included in your revenues, the state doesn't allow you to consider those, quote, available. They're restricted because you don't actually have the cash. So those types of things total $1,667,644. You have a couple of other restrictions. The main ones are you have some funds set aside for your capital reserve fund, and you also have some funds set aside for your law enforcement officer special separation allowance. Those are the largest ones. When you subtract all of those restrictions out, you're left with what we call unassigned or undesignated fund balance. And that number at June 30th is $3,461,071. That number more than satisfies your minimum fund balance policy, which is $1,750,000. If you compare that unassigned fund balance, the $3.4 million, if you compare that to your total expenditures for the year, it represents about 59% of your expenditures or 7 months of operating expenses. Bottom line is you have a very strong undesignated unassigned fund balance. Does anybody have any questions on those numbers? Okay.
Thank you.
Just a couple of other things on pages 14 and 15. You're going to see over on page 15 that there's a column for your Canal Capital Project Fund. That's because that fund was closed out in the June 17 fiscal year. So you see it over on the on page 15, but you don't see it on page 14 because the funds were transferred from the Capital Project Fund into the general fund when that fund was closed out. And the header that says total non-major fund, that's your cemetery fund. And you ended the year with $56,763 in your cemetery fund. That's where you stand at June 30th, kind of in a nutshell. Just a couple of other things. I mentioned earlier that we report financials in two ways. The second way that we report financials is what we call the government-wide basis, and they're different from these statements that we looked at. If you'll notice, looking at these statements, we don't record things like typical governments record, like depreciation and debt. So what we do is we take exhibits 3 and 4 and we convert those to what we call a government-wide basis, where we actually add in your fixed assets and we add in your debt to those numbers. And that's what you're going to have on exhibits 1 and 2, are what we call government-wide statements. At the bottom of exhibit 3 and 4, you're going to see how you take those numbers from the fund level and you expand them to the government-wide basis. There's a reconciliation at the bottom of each of those statements to show how you get to the government-wide level. Just FYI, the town doesn't have anything that we would consider to be traditional debt, like you haven't gone out and borrowed any money that you owe on. But there are other liabilities that are included in your government-wide statements for things like pension liabilities and other like retiree health benefits and things like that, that are pretty typical to it, that are very typical to a local government. Governments were required to implement a new standard this year for pensions, which affected the reporting for the law enforcement officer special separation allowance. That's a specific retirement that law enforcement officers are entitled to when they retire. They get that until they're 62. You had always reported an asset and a liability for that plan, but these new accounting standards changed the way that that was measured, and that was implemented last year. So there are some additional notes in your financial statements regarding that. But overall, I just want to say the town has ended the year in very strong financial condition. I'd be happy to answer any questions, and if you have anything that comes up, you know, once you've had a chance to peruse the statements, please feel free to give me a call, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
I just have one on page 36, long-term obligations.
Yes.
It said we had a legal debt margin of $107,611,000.
That's kind of a crazy calculation. I don't know. I've never audited anybody that had anywhere near what their legal debt margin is, and why the state would allow you to even
Get that far.
use that calculation or use that, I'm not sure, but that's their calculation. That's a state calculation.
Now, have the local government group approved our audit, or is that in
It has been
process?
submitted. I have not received the final authorization or the final approval from them, but I will tell you, when they do their review of the audit, they're doing a technical review. They're not looking to see if the numbers are right. They're dependent on me for that because I've done the audit. They're doing more of what would be considered a technical review.
And what would that technical, what's considered a technical?
What kind of things? They kind of just go through a checklist and make sure that all of the note disclosures are included. But I mean, they wouldn't have any way to really know if the numbers were correct because they depend on me to do that.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
We have to have their approval, though, before we can broadcast this. Is that not correct?
Yes, I would prefer for you to wait until you get the approval. We wouldn't want to put something out on your website that, you know, hadn't been approved by them, just in case they come back with some minor, you know, technical thing that we might need to change. But I don't expect anything. But we should have that in the next couple of days because I know they downloaded your report this morning. So it's sent to them electronically. So they have it and they're reviewing it as we speak.
Any other questions, council?
I don't have any.
Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you all very much.
Appreciate your coming out.
Again, if you have any
Report.
questions come up, please let me know. Thank you.
So much.
Great job.
I want to take a minute and commend our our finance officer for her effort this year and years past, for that matter, but just for a terrific job. Bonnie, I appreciate it very much. And I think the old expression, the proof's in the pudding. I think you see our financial statement and our town position, and you have to know that someone's put an awful lot of work into making that happen. And I appreciate your efforts, Bonnie, very much. And I also appreciate Peter's efforts as our budget officer in making sure that Bonnie is staying busy back there and doing her job.
Thank you.
Thank you, both. Town planner, the report. Hi, Wes. Good evening.
Thank you. Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. I have a brief report for y'all tonight for the month of September. There were 6 zoning permits issued, 21 building permits issued. Those consisted of 3 new single-family dwellings, 4 remodels, 3 additions, 2 accessories, 2 repairs, and 7 others. There are 23 single-family dwellings currently under construction in the town, and the total amount of fees we collected in September was $13,086.86, or 80 cents. With respect to code enforcement, we mailed 1 warning citation for the uncontrolled growth of grass. And with respect to the town planning board, they have a regularly scheduled meeting on October the 16th, and that's to review conditional use permit application CUP 1702, which is an application to open a Jersey Mike's Subs restaurant in the Marketplace Shopping Center. In addition, depending on how the timing of that review goes, the board may continue their review and discussion of the town code update project as well at that meeting following the conditional use permit review. Any questions?
Council?
No, I don't have any.
Thank you, Wes.
Thank you.
I think we're all set. David Cole, our police chief. Good evening, David. Again.
Good evening, Mayor and members of council. The Police Department's September 2017 report. As you can see, we had 726 calls for service. If you look at the breakdown of the incidents, we had 13 of those. We had 8 criminal arrests for the month of September. We had a total of 4 motor vehicle accidents. And out of 48 traffic stops, the officers issued 14 written citations and another 28 warning citations. And under the local ordinance violations, we had a total of 30 of those for the month. Any questions, comments?
I don't have anything regarding the numbers there, but I see a lot of discussion regarding the number of automobile break-ins within the area. Any comments, thoughts? It seems like people are
Yeah.
leaving cars unlocked and weapons in them.
Same thing I say every time, lock your cars.
Yeah.
Because the majority of these vehicles were unlocked. Kill Devil Hills has just been devastated. We've had our share, but nothing like south of us, and Duck has had that too. I just can't stress enough that, you know, the best deterrence is locking your vehicle, and then they'll move on to the house next door. So that's a good question, but yeah, summer's over. So,
I guess the question I have, or not question, comment, is it appears that a large number of them have left their weapons in their, their concealed weapon in their vehicle.
yeah, that's another discussion for another time.
Yeah.
But yeah, when that happens, they shouldn't be allowed to possess a weapon anymore.
I agree with that.
One other thing I would like to mention, Sheila had already put it out in the broadcast, and the Outer Banks Voice had picked it up too. But I just want to share again the overwhelming, humbled by the enormous donations that this community brought forth. The North Carolina Chiefs Association and several of us that are members of the FBI National Academy, we're trying to help out a former classmate who happens to be the chief in Houston. And we put a drive together to help out the police officers and their families that were devastated by Hurricane Harvey. And I was just overwhelmed and humbled by the community here. Was just unbelievable. I never fathomed how much. And I'd just like to officially, on behalf of all police officers, thank you. Anything else?
Yeah, I have a question, David. So this question was prompted by a comment from one of our residents, and I just want to ask you point blank, if it's factual. Were you ever directed by council or a council member not to ticket speeders or drivers running stop signs on summer weekends because they were visitors? Has that ever been brought to you in any way, or has council ever asked you not to do that?
No, and I think the people that know me would know what I would tell them. I don't answer to council. We don't discriminate our officers. The best tool they have is discretion, and I leave that to them. But there is no way that we would ever do something like that. I think the community knows me a little bit better than that. Matter of fact, Peter and I have had discussions where we've actually, during certain incidents that have happened, we've actually discussed zero tolerance. But we don't discriminate. You break the law,
You break
get
the law.
arrested.
That was my thought. That was my thought as well.
Don't matter if you live here, you live in, I won't pick on, well, I'll pick on New Jersey because that's where my lieutenant's from. It really doesn't matter. Yeah, and I've heard some of the similar rumors. Just don't believe everything you read on Facebook. If you
Yeah.
want the truth, go to the National Enquirer.
Thank you.
Anything else?
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Ed Limbacher, our fire chief. Evening, Ed.
Evening, Council. For the month of September, Fire Department responded to 44 calls. One structure fire, one vehicle fire, one outside equipment fire, which is actually an AC unit outside that set the vinyl siding on fire, 28 EMS calls, one motor vehicle accident, 2 gas leaks, 5 public service, and a total of 5 fire alarms, for again, a total of 44. Pretty uneventful month for us for once, so. Anybody have any questions?
How's that compare to last year?
Well behind last year at 75 for last year, but I looked into it and it basically amounted to patient assist, which it appears that one of our people that were needing help in and out of the house
Oh,
got
okay.
better, so that's good.
Yes.
So. Anybody have any other questions?
Council? Thank you, Ed.
You're
Appreciate it. Town manager's report?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. I have some reminders tonight and as well as some announcements for the manager's report. As you've been notified, all of us have been notified by Department of Transportation and the contractor, the Wright Memorial Bridge, that will, the eastbound lane bridge will be closed. And over the next 2 weeks, there's going to be a shifting of 1 lane to 2 lanes, et cetera, from eastbound to westbound. I'm informed by the contractor in about 2 weeks, though, the entire eastbound, which is the original, not original, but the older of the 2 spans will be closed for the winter and the spring. The emergency management coordinator has been in contact, of course, with the contractor, so if there are any needs for emergency vehicles to use an express lane, they have that taken care of, according to the county. I did want to report to you last meeting, there was a small discussion about the Gingheit Mallard Cove Pond. The town attorney informs me they're still working on an opinion on title for that. So until that comes, I won't be able to dialogue with the property owners around that pond until that point in time. We're still waiting on that. The town's contract for townwide beach profile survey will begin as soon as the current county contract for beach nourishment is completed. I had a discussion with our coastal engineer today, and they'll be starting that just as soon as the last bit of sand is placed in Kitty Hawk. And our town's sand fencing contractor, again, has been delayed. Hopefully, he's informed me today he hopes to start on Monday, but because of the 2 hurricanes and high water, he was delayed in Kildover Hills. And the plan was, as soon as he finished Kildover Hills, he would come here and start. So we've been on that work on a day, every other day basis to hopefully push him along. As I previously reported to the council members, the preliminary design for the Palmetto Lane rebuild project, those design plans are available to the public online and also in the town hall for inspection. And tomorrow they'll be meeting with residents and property owners on Palmetto Lane, as has been our practice. Also wanted to report to you that the Division of Coastal Management is required on the town to submit revisions to its Camel Major permit application for the Yopon Trail rebuild project. So they were submitted on September 18th, and of course, by law, there's a new 75-day clock that starts at that point in time. So we're still being delayed with that project with the Camel Major permit consideration for the end of the street. And also wanted to remind that the council's infrastructure improvement planning committee meets here in the Pitt Center tomorrow at 2 p.m. That'll be the inaugural meeting. Did want to also remind you that it gone out in a notice that the owner of the Marketplace Shopping Center will be doing some upgrades to its sewer system, and because of that, they'll be doing some traffic reroutes within the shopping center parking area. Don't think that's going to affect either the entrances going in from the public streets, but they have notified us of that. Also happy to report to council that today the town received its federal share of the FEMA reimbursement for Hurricane Matthew recovery expenses for the town of Southern Shores. $343,674 were received today, and we're informed, of course, that the state's share of $114,558 is in process. So hopefully that'll be very quickly following that. So that has been placed into the town's assets as of today. October 13th will be the date for the Falls large item pickup announcement day. That will not be the date of the pickup, but that will be, as we have practiced for several years now, the date that we'll begin announcing the date of large item pickup. And recall that we do that practice so as to not encourage early dumping throughout the town. So on that date, we'll be giving out a date, and we'll be publishing it in the newspapers and also on all the town's media, as well as to when the date would be for the large item pickup. And finally, I did want to mention to each of you, as directed by you at the last council meeting, I've previously supplied each of you with the cost estimates for traffic control devices and the necessary law enforcement personnel for conducting a shutdown of left turns at US Highway 58 at South Dogwood Trail intersection, as well as the US 158 and Juniper Trail intersection. So recall, I transmitted those to you about 10 days ago. And that's the manager's report. I'd be glad to answer any question on town operations, if anybody has anything.
Do we have a date for the large item pickup? Actual date when it'll be done? Do we have that yet?
I do, but we're not going to announce it until October 13th.
Oh, okay. Just checking. I know somebody will ask me.
Yes, they have been calling me as well.
Okay.
And a classic example is the query, I'm going out of town tomorrow. I'd like to go ahead and put my stuff out even though it's a month away. And that's what we have been struggling with for the last few years, dumping all over town, and it just sits there.
Thank you,
Any other
Peter. I'd like
questions?
to- Councilman, any
I
questions?
don't-
I'd like to follow up your comment about the intersection blocking the turn lane and so forth, the intersection of highway at South Dogwood and 158. I had a conversation yesterday with Mr. Jennings, our District 1 engineer, a follow-up conversation with him, and asked him his thoughts about possibly asking a traffic consultant, traffic management person, traffic engineer, highway engineer to come in and talk to our council about maybe assist us in dealing with this summer traffic issue. We've had forums about it, and we've talked about it in council meetings over and over again, and we always come up with the same solution to somehow close the traffic on Dogwood Trail, or limit the traffic on Dogwood Trail on the weekends, but the people that are most impacted are the people who live on Hillcrest and Sea Oats and Wax Myrtle, the north end of our town. And I'm not sure we're not just passing that traffic a little further down 158 or further up Highway 12 before they come up and take the same routes they've been taking for years. So I thought I'd ask council tonight that we ask, I'm going to back up one step. Mr. Jennings sent me 3 companies that he has used and recommends for this type of service and this type of advice and counsel. I would like to ask council tonight to join me in asking our town manager to invite at least one of those companies to come to our next council meeting, or possibly one in January, and talk to us about some of the possibilities here that we are maybe overlooking. Not saying we are, but maybe we are. I'd make a motion to that effect, council, if I could, that we have Peter invite one of these companies to come in and talk to us in December or as soon thereafter as practical. I would like to make a motion this be done. Do I have a second?
I'll second it.
Any discussion? Any thoughts?
I think we need to have somebody that's got the skill or has had the experience of working on these type of areas, because I can't believe we're the only one in the U.S. that has had to address this type of issue within our towns. And they'd bring a different maybe perspective and maybe eliminate some of the emotion out of it as well.
That was Mr. Jennings' comment to me, that it might be good to have someone come in as basically a third party who doesn't have a dog in the fight, so to speak, and talk to us about what the options are, what we've been considering, and whether there's a better option that we should consider. And I don't know the answer, but I would like to have us do that. So if there's no further discussion, or if it is.
I got a question.
Yes, sir.
Could we get in advance their resumes? I'd like to know where they've consulted, what cities, something
Absolutely.
about the issues that they've dealt with in the past.
I don't think that'd be a problem at all. But he gave me some names of companies. One of those companies has been under contract with Duck for a number of years with some of their improvements to their downtown area. It's a company out of Virginia Beach. That's one of them. There's 2 other companies in Raleigh. I could ask Peter to try to give us some background information on them.
Yeah.
Yeah, excuse me if I could. I met with the deputy division engineer at lunch today and had a discussion with him about the 3 companies that Mr. Jennings forwarded to you, Mayor. And one of those companies has a general manager, or one of the companies has the former district engineer for our district working with them, who's very familiar with these traffic problems. So he's one, we'll go vet all 3 of them, but that's just an example of one of the companies that was listed there.
Any questions?
I just asked one question. Do any of those companies have experience in confusing the apps that direct people into our neighborhoods? Working with the technology end as well? Because that's where a lot of people try to bypass 12 and 158.
Exactly.
They're routed down through our neighborhoods. So,
That's normally going to be the first timer.
well,
The second timer isn't going to be using his app. He'll know how to get through, unfortunately.
I'm just wondering if, maybe one of them have experience doing that, because if they can confuse those apps, that would, people wouldn't be looking to do that left turn.
That's a good point. One other thing that Jerry pointed out to me, and I think may be helpful, is signage. Like if you notice when you come back from, come from anywhere, coming to the Outer Banks, there's signs that say how long it takes you to get there using this route versus that route. And the NCDOT has done that in the last few years. And maybe a sign as you come across the bridge that says Duck and points north via 158 and Highway 12 is 1 hour and 20 minutes. Via Dogwood Trail is 1 hour and 50 minutes. That could also help us too if we had some way of keeping that, making that work for us, and it could. But if
And I think that'd be a good idea too, Tom, because the thing people don't understand, the app sends them through the neighborhood, but once they get through the neighborhood, they can't go anywhere.
Right.
I mean, they're
Yeah.
stuck. And
Yeah.
what we're doing is just stacking traffic in the neighborhood.
Just a quick statement on that. A good friend of mine lives on Hillcrest, and he came out to mow his yard one day this summer, his front yard, which takes normally about 25 minutes to mow. And when he started mowing, there was a car sitting there right in the middle of the street on Hillcrest, right in the middle of his yard. And when he finished mowing the yard, the car was still sitting there. 20, 25 minutes, and the guy hadn't moved at all. But he was happy to be on Hillcrest. He wasn't on Highway 12, I guess. Anyhow, thank you. I'd like to motion, I'd like to,
Can we, I think it's crucial to ask him when he speaks to look at the comprehensive approach, like you had indicated before, not just Dogwood, some of the other folks, Wax Myrtle, and I'm sure he'll do this, but the consequences, each move we make is going to have trickle down in some way. So that would just be my comment on this.
thank you, Chris. I'm sure that's, Peter can convey that to him, or whoever we bring in. So I have a motion on the floor. It's been seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you, council. Moving along here, let's see. Town attorney's report.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Very briefly, the Nyes v. Emerald Isle case that we've talked about a few times about the public's ability to use the ocean beaches. If you recall, it came out of the Court of Appeals, and then a number of towns got involved when it went to the North Carolina Supreme Court, and that appeal was ultimately dismissed. The Nyes sought an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, and yesterday was the second. The U.S. Supreme Court denied their appeal. So absent a very unlikely, there's one little thing that they may be able to do that it's very unlikely. The Nyes Court of Appeals case will stand as the law in North Carolina until someone takes it to the Supreme Court, another case to the Supreme Court, and gets a different answer. Hopefully they'll get the same answer though. So just the end of that saga, hopefully.
So that little note you put at the end of your explanation to us, they can't take that back to the North Carolina Supreme Court.
No, it's over in North Carolina. There's a slight chance that they could ask the U.S. Supreme Court for a rehearing. Say, you got it wrong last week. Can you change your mind? And the initial petition was a long shot. The rehearing is a real long shot. And that's all I have, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Planning Board Chairperson, Sam Williams. Good evening, Sam.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, Council.
Evening.
The first thing I want to do tonight is thank the council for approving the election of planning board officers. Even though it was in your consent agenda, I think most people don't realize who was elected officers. I was re-elected chair, and Joe McGraw was not re-elected, but elected vice chair. Zoning text amendment, ZTA 17-05. This is to allow living space and accessory structures. The applicant was the town, and the purpose was to allow living space and accessory structures, to clarify definitions of dwelling unit and living space, and to have the living space in any accessory structure to contribute towards the $6,000 square foot limit that the council had put in place last year. The changes and comments, the dwelling unit was basically defined as the space that contains a stove or stoves and oven. And since the planning board sent our proposed changes in, it's come to my attention that we missed some things in that paragraph. It's Part 1, Section 36-57. If you look in your copy of the proposed copy of the ZTA from the Planning Board, it's on page 2, line 15. And we should have made that rather than stoves, and rather than ovens. And we should have not stricken sleeping, sleeping facilities. So I would propose amending the planning board proposal to add an S to make stoves plural and oven plural, and add back in the sleeping facilities that we had knocked out. That's the definition of the dwelling unit, has the stove or oven, or stoves or ovens. Living space does not contain stove or stoves or ovens. And the accessory structures, there's no dwelling unit in accessory structures, no stove or oven. And in the living spaces, you can have microwaves, hot plates, toaster ovens. The planning board decided that even though there's been discussions about whether that's cooking or not, for the purposes of this zoning text amendment and the code, we decided to consider that not cooking. If you consider somebody putting a man cave over a garage, is he going to put in a microwave or toaster oven, something like that? Yeah, it's a real possibility. So it's things like that that we discussed, that we decided to definition-wise separating by including the stove or oven in a dwelling unit and living space without the stove and oven. Also, the living space was to contribute to the 6,000 square foot limit, and that's in Part 6, Section 36-102. That's on page 3, line 16. We didn't specifically reference the 6,000 square foot in there, adding to the 6,000 square foot. We put in a more generic term in case there's something else that comes up, so we don't have to go back and modify the code. The phrase that we used was, on lots where enclosed living space is permitted within accessory structures, the living space within an accessory structure shall count towards any living space restrictions for the principal building. And that picks up the 6,000 square feet.
Does that pick up the parking spaces and
No, the parking spaces is not covered in that
the
structure.
30%? I mean, 30%?
We're talking about the council last year put a 6,000 square foot limit on
Structures.
on structures. And what we're saying here is that any accessory structure, suppose there's not a living space over a garage, you come back in and put it in, or they plan to put it in at the beginning, that counts towards the 6,000 square feet.
Okay, do they have to do the parking for the bedroom if
We-
it becomes a living space?
We did not, this is ETA had to do with accessory structures and so on, so we did not.
Not lot coverage.
We did not.
You got lot coverage in there, but you can't go over their lot coverage either.
Well, I'm talking about the lot coverage
Right.
also.
Right.
We did not discuss, and this is ETA, any changes in the parking. And I'll get to that. It's something that we are going to have to look at later, I believe. The parking requirements, if you look in the Module 1, the contractor had made an estimate based on some numbers, so many square feet of space in the building, you had to have so many parking spaces.
Right.
6,000 square foot structure would require 40 parking spaces. With those sorts of numbers, we've got to go back and look at, just to see if that's a reasonable number to stick with. But anyway, we
You
did
said-
not address parking requirements.
Excuse me, Sam, did you say 4 or 40?
40.
40, wow. Okay, thank you.
6,000 square feet, and I think the numbers is something like for every 150 square feet, you have to have one or
Parking space.
1.5. Do you remember, Wes? Something like that.
Based on septic capacity. Either way, the septic capacity for the accessory structure and the principal structure, whatever that is, based on the health department's permit, that's how many parking spaces are required.
Okay, so Wes, if the accessory structure is added a living space with bathroom, then they're going to have to increase their parking, is what you're saying?
It depends on how many occupants or the single-family dwelling, it depends on what the septic capacity is for the principal structure. If it's 6, and say they get, the accessory structure requires an additional 2 occupants, which would increase it to 8, the parking spaces remain the same. If you go above that, then there's a formula that would require more spaces. But I think up to 8 is 3 spaces you have to provide. That doesn't change.
Okay.
If you go beyond 8 occupants for the property, if you were saying that you will allow accessory structures, then yes, you'll be required to provide additional parking. It's all based on the occupants.
And Wes, am I correct in saying that the number of occupants is based, the health department typically says 2 per bedroom, roughly?
Usually, yes, sir, that's the way it works.
Usually. Now, you can add more if the owner could say, we want more in there, but then that would increase their parking requirements.
Right.
Potentially, if above, so 8, potentially, like, in a hypothetical basis, 8 occupants would be roughly a 4-bedroom house.
Right.
So beyond that, you'd need to add more spots. Like
That's my question.
Yep.
So did we account for that, is what my question was.
I think
If you got a 4-bedroom home and you add an accessory structure with a living space above it,
then it would affect it.
Then
They
it
would
would
have to add
affect.
more septic to carry that, and if it went to the 5th bedroom, it would add another parking spot.
because when I read this, I don't see that 6,000 in there, and I don't see that 30% in there, and I don't see parking spaces in there. So that's why I'm asking. I mean,
None of those other.
maybe we should identify that. So
None of those other
everybody knows.
lot coverage wouldn't change,
Right.
so if they go over.
But if we're building a new accessory structure, lot
if it-
coverage would change.
No.
No,
Yes, it
Well,
would.
it would change, but the requirement would change.
the requirement, the 30% requirement would remain the same.
Well, I understand that,
The-
but so the amount of, if
Yeah.
you're at 30% with your house, you
do it.
can't do it.
And you
Exactly
can't do
right.
it, that's
Yeah,
exactly
you
right.
can't
But if
do
you're
it.
at 20% and you want to put a garage in with a living space or a dwelling unit above it, then that is permitted, provided you can provide the parking if it were a dwelling unit, or
Living
you
space.
can go above 30%.
Yeah, my question is basically clarity on those things. I'm okay with what we're talking about. I just want to make sure that we don't go over our lot coverage, and we don't go over our 6,000 square feet, and we provide parking.
Okay.
And the septic has to, I mean, that's the county. It has to be there.
Yeah.
Mr. Mayor, just want to remind you, the council that when you get to 8A on the agenda, after this report's over, there is a separate staff report for staff's position on this matter as well. So those matters will probably come up during that staff report.
That's after the public hearing.
Yes, sir. It's 8A on the agenda, yes, sir.
Right. Thank you.
Can I ask Sam a quick question?
Sure.
I did see it in here, but maybe you can help me with this or talk to me about your discussions. Initially, there was a lot of questions about whether this accessory structure had to be connected with conditioned space or unconditioned space. Could you describe how you address that, or if you've removed that connection requirement? Because maybe we talked about connected by a deck or not connected at all. What was your discussion like in that?
We did not discuss whether it had to be attached or not. If you think about a garage, it may not have to be attached, but if you put living space above the garage, there's your accessory structure with living space included. But we didn't have a requirement for it to be attached.
Okay, so that's, your intent was that there isn't necessarily, you don't have to, that is your intent.
Right.
Anything else?
As far as the recommendations of the planning board, we found the ZTA is consistent with the land use plan as a reasonable and in the public interest. And the planning board recommends approval of the proposed ZTA. That's the planning board's version of the proposed ZTA 17-05 as amended. The amendments are the things I mentioned about making stove and ovens plural and putting in the sleeping facilities.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
So, just to be very clear, so we have an accessory structure, let's say it's a garage, not attached to a home. That space above that garage could now be conditioned, whereas previously it wasn't allowed to be conditioned. That space could be used as a dwelling unit, which means
Not a dwelling unit.
not a dwelling unit. That's what I want to clarify. It could be used
The
as a
dwelling-
living area,
It can be used as a living space,
living space, but not a dwelling unit
but
in
not
your
a dwelling
proposal.
unit.
Okay, so nobody could, there's no beds, there's no bed that could be in there in your proposal. Is that correct?
It could, you could put a bed in there.
The distinction that you're making is, so it's not a bedroom, your distinction you're making is cooking area.
Yes.
Correct.
Yes.
So they could do anything, as long as they didn't have a stove in that area, they could make it a bedroom, they'd have to deal with parking and some of the other requirements and lot coverage. They still have to do all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
The only restriction on use would be the stove, cooking.
Stove, yes, the stove and oven.
You're either gonna have a bedroom or a kitchen. Am I correct?
As far as, you
You're
could
you're gonna have it either or, you can't have both.
you could put a bedroom in.
Right,
But you could not have a stove and oven.
that's correct, that's what I said, it's either or on that part.
Right.
But you're not saying either or, you're saying absolutely cannot be a stove, correct?
In living space, you cannot have a stove or oven. The principal structure is a dwelling unit, and you can have stove or stoves, or oven or ovens
Gotcha.
in the principal structure.
Gotcha. But in that accessory structure, there's no stove, it doesn't matter what you do. And however you use it, whether it be as bedroom, man cave, cabana, whatever it is, heated and cooled garage, that's up to you. Is that
Art
correct?
studio or.
Art studio, there's 8
whatever.
million uses. Okay.
Well, let me ask you this, Sam. Under our current zoning, it could be rented as a sleepover room. Is that correct?
Wes, correct me if I'm wrong, currently, you cannot rent that legally. But we all know that with Airbnb,
That's what
there
I'm
are
getting
rentals
at.
going on today, and a lot of people have neighbors that are renting these spaces, and, you know, there may be an extra car. They don't even realize it until somebody happens to mention that it's there.
Yeah.
And the whole issue of renting of living space, not the dwelling unit, but the living space, is something that I think we need to readdress, because it's currently not permitted, but, you know, how controlling this, enforcing it is very difficult. You've got rental houses, why not rental in living spaces? It's barely noticed now. And if you look at the home-based business section, you might even be able to justify it under a home-based business.
Yeah,
I
but-
didn't look at that in great detail, but it's something that needs to be looked at.
But if we're not allowing it to be a bedroom, then that kind of solves our rental problem. It could be used, conditioned space and all that, it could be used as an office or studio or whatever, but it wouldn't be suitable for renting as a sleeping room. So we could control it by not allowing sleeping in that space.
Well, you don't allow that now, and it still occurs. One of the folks that spoke in the public comment period when we were discussing this pointed out that where he came from, that the town actually, you had to get a permit or a license to be able to rent out space. And that way, you know, the town could know where they are, and if they wanted to set minimum standards for something like that, they could do that.
Fred, if I may, I know in Chickahawk, we had this issue come up, and that would be considered a multifamily or a duplex type situation, and not speaking for SSCA, but in Chickahawk, that is not permitted according to the
Covenants.
covenants. So that doesn't mean that somebody
enforce
doesn't
that
do
one.
it, but,
That doesn't,
but,
that doesn't apply here.
well, no, but I'm just trying
Right.
to answer.
So, Sam, you said there, it can't be a bedroom above.
That's not what he said.
No, he said he could.
Okay, that's what I was thinking, because that's why I
wondering,
wanted
yeah.
clarity. Okay, and tell me again how that differs from renting a house week to week?
The,
From,
it-
I'm just asking because you brought up a great point.
renting a house is a dwelling unit, contains stove or stoves or oven or ovens. That's not permitted in living space. And even though you could have a microwave or toaster oven, a hot plate, the difference is whether you can have a stove or oven. But I suspect that most of the accessory structures are not large enough to have a separate bedroom and, you know, kitchenette and that sort of thing. But
There's some large accessory
there are some
buildings
large,
in
but
our
most I
community.
suspect, you know, would be difficult to do that.
But, you know, one great room with a bed and
Yeah,
sitting area could constitute, you know, Airbnb would
a
work.
sleeper sofa.
Exactly. So,
Any more questions on that? The last thing that I want to mention is that back at the September 6th Town Council meeting, we were talking about Planning Board's efforts to try to shorten the review time of the Module 1 of the Town Code update. And during the discussion, Council charged the Planning Board with going back and identifying and ranking the most complex issues, and to bring that recommended ranking back to the council for approval with the plan to look at the highest rank items first. And I had sent the council yesterday the ranking so that you wouldn't come into this meeting cold to just look at it. But the items that were on the list was stormwater, and the things that came up particularly of interest in the citizen survey was the water flowing onto streets from property, private property, and also water flowing onto adjacent properties. The second ranked item is tree removal on private property. And since I've been on the planning board, we've looked at that whole issue 3 or 4 times. And variances have even come before us as the planning board, or Board of Adjustment. No, I take that back, not the variances, ZTAs. The third item was the side yard setback requirements on 50-foot wide lots. In the last 6 months, 7 months, we've had 3 variance requests for that, and we've discussed that. Parking requirements for rental properties. That's on the list to look at. I believe that was generated from the fact that there's a lot of folks in town that don't like to see some of these rental houses with the space under the house and the complete driveway filled with cars and cars on the lawns. Years ago, it used to be people would come on vacation, the family would hop into one car and maybe grandma and grandpa into the second car, and so you'd have 2 cars at a house. These days, with these very large rental units with 8, 10 bedrooms, you've got, 4, 5, 6, 7, maybe 8 cars, because kids come to visit and they all drive their own cars. So it just, there's a lot of cars for some of these rental homes. But that's the next item that was on the list. Commercial design standards, that's things like saying what the pitched roofs or what building materials. Nags Head has some design standards for commercial areas. And so that's what that is. And the last one on the list is relocating oceanfront homes because of advancing high tides. In other words, removing restrictions that might be there so that these homes cannot currently or have difficulty being moved back away from the water. And so that's the last thing on the list. And, things that were not on the list, but were the result of the discussion of the ZTA, which took place at the meeting after we did the ranking, where some of the items we already talked about, the parking and rental of living space, those were the two that came up. Also, if you look in Module 1, in the notes at the bottom of a lot of the pages, there are things, comments like this needs further discussion and so on, that there's nothing as complex or as big as the ones that are listed here. So anyway, that's my report on the ranking or recommended rankings of the complex issues.
I got a question on number 2, tree removal on private property. Does that include clear cutting?
Well, that would include clear cutting. It would include something like a proposal that, you had to keep 20% of the trees on the property. It would include clear cutting except a border of 5 feet of vegetation all the way around the property. It could include anything. And that's one of the things that in private property rights is one of the things that make this whole tree cutting thing very difficult.
Thanks.
Any other questions for Sam?
No, I don't.
Thank you, Sam. Appreciate it. And council, as I see it, unless you want to change the priorities or discuss us changing the priorities, there's no action required here. He's given us what he's going to want to present to us over in the future. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. And we'll stay with these priorities as far as what he presents to us and the sequence he presents them in. This time, we'll hear from the Historic Landmarks Commission, Chairperson Whitley. Good evening.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and Town Council. As you know, my name is Lee Whitley. I'm chairperson of the new Historic Landmarks Commission. I would like to acknowledge several of the commission members that are here tonight, Lorelei Costa and Tony DiBernardo. Chris Chiosis and Richard Perkins are also on our commission. They're not here tonight. I do want to express my appreciation to all of them for their insight and participation in the commission. I think together we all make a great team. I also especially want to acknowledge the hard work and follow through on our behalf from Wes Haskett. He's really been instrumental in guiding us and giving us a lot of information that the state has provided from different historic groups around the state. And I really appreciate that. His input is important. Tonight I'm just here to request that the Town Council accept our board's official recommendation to designate 23 Porpoise Run, which is owned by Courtney Clements, as our first historic landmark. It's referred to as LDA 17-01. Thank you.
Thank you. This time, we'll have general public comment. Our first speaker tonight is Joe Van Giesen. Good evening, Joe.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor. I'm back again. With regards to the proposals that have been received by the town to form a update of the Coastal Area Management Act land use plan. I see no reason for making a decision on the selection of a CAMA land use plan consultant tonight. I can find no evaluation or recommendation from the town staff, which I would expect to be part of normal course of town business. The second proposal was dated September 11th, so I believe there was sufficient time for at least a preliminary evaluation before tonight's meeting. I would expect at a minimum that a determination of conformance with the requirements of the solicitation would have been completed by now. There were 2 bids received. The N-Focus bid is valid through June 2018, and the HPC bid did not seem to include an expiration date, so I don't know how long that one is valid, but it could be evaluated, it could be determined with a phone call, I think. HCP seems to have, it might be HPC, I got it backwards maybe, seems to have more corporate experience with coastal communities, while N-Focus has almost none. Although one of N-Focus staff, Michael Harvey, seems to have experience in coastal community planning. The land use plan is driven by and must address the requirements of the Coastal Area Management Act, which suggests that a consultant with CAMA experience would be preferred. Only HPC has demonstrated experience. For example, the Oak Island 2016 CAMA land use plan was prepared by them. I urge the council to postpone a decision on selection of the land use plan consultant until the Oak Island CAMA land use plan can be reviewed and the town of Oak Island can be interviewed regarding their experience with HPC. Also, the Atlantic Beach, Beaufort, and Cedar Island administrations could be contacted regarding the scope and quality of Mr. Harvey's work, who is with N-Focus for those towns. Pending positive response, Mr. Harvey's participation on the project could be requested prior to the award if N-Focus was selected. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Claire Sutton. Good evening.
I'm Claire Sutton, a resident of Fairway Drive for the past 30 years. And that was Fairway Drive was the first street that y'all decided to do for the capital improvement plan, which was in 2014. When considering how I might outline the completed work, I remember how previous members of the board and the mayor addressed it back then. They'll get used to it. The town removed 44 big hardwoods from the town easement, regraded and installed curb guttering and catch basins at intervals along the new pavement. The result, as you know, is a far cry from the ambience of the old, simple village street. And we haven't gotten used to it. Unfortunately, you made our street urban ordinary. Rather than passing the blame around and reliving the stress of that time in October of 2014, I'm here to ask you, as a newer board, with more sensitive members, to help the town fix the mistakes. Fairway should be a lesson to listen to the outcry of the people who actually live on these streets. Surely you know how to use future road improvement design to maintain the picturesque neighborhoods and side streets, not just to be modern and appease DOT rules for something far out in the future. We hope you will join together and never bulldoze through public opinion again without proper polling, research, and planning. I dare say we all grew up told by our parents, if we break something, fix it. So without tearing into the problems that arose in 2014, we'll all take the blame. But we residents on Fairway still want a few things corrected. That's why I'm here. There's 3 things. To redesign and reconstruct the entry median, fix the almost unmaneuverable route around it. It's the first thing you see as you enter, and as you drive in, your choice is 1, hit a mailbox, 2, head straight into the Crepe Myrtle, or 3, sideswipe a leaning speed sign. It's a tight fit. That speed sign limit has been leaning for about 2 years now. It's just, you know, a little bit of an angle. Nobody has bothered to even straighten it up, and it's a little bit of an eyesore. Number 2 is vegetation. We can't regain the calm, quiet welcome that used to greet drivers, walkers, and strollers. We can't do anything about the loss of ambiance. but we can ask the town to complete their promise to review the planting of new vegetation. A letter sent out to the residents in September of 2015 promised to reevaluate replanting schedule in the spring of 2016. So far, only 3 crepe myrtles and some grasses in the mosquito pits have been planted, a far cry from the 44 big, beautiful hardwoods that were unnecessarily removed October 6, 2014, 3 years ago next week. Let's hire an educated botanist to join with the neighbors who live on Fairway and create a planting of native hardwoods and blooming shrubs. They've already hit. That would appease us and be a good start on recreating the lost atmosphere. And number 3, to remodel, reconstruct, and redirect the present failed storm runoff, as well as the street pavement and curbs. Catchwater basins that were put in with the plan are now either swamps or mosquito nurseries.
Thank you, Ms. Sutton. Appreciate it.
Well, that was quick.
Well, I didn't set the timer. The timer goes 3 minutes. Thank you. This time we'll close public comment. Under old business, we have a public hearing. The purpose is to consider ZTA-17-05, a zoning text amendment application submitted by the town of Southern Shores per directive of council August 1st, 2017, to amend the Southern Shores Town Code by amending section 16-5, section 3657, section 36202, section 36203, section 36205, section 36208, and section 36101 to allow living space within accessory structures. It's tab 3 in our book, folks. This time I'll call on our town attorney to conduct the public hearing to consider this ZTA.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
You're welcome.
This is a legislative zoning decision. The participants will not be sworn. You'll have, you won't be limited in time, but if you talk too long, I may have to raise my hand and ask you to move on. What I'll do is have a brief staff presentation by Mr. Haskett, and then I'll call on members of the audience who wish to speak to this zoning text amendment. And Sheila, was there a sign-up sheet for this as well? Thank you.
I didn't get one, so there must be one back.
So we'll open the public hearing to consider ZTA 17-05, zoning text amendment regarding living space and accessory structures. Mr. Haskett.
Thank you, Ben. Good evening again, members of the council, Mr. Mayor. For tonight's staff report for ZTA-1705, Mayor Bennett has introduced the sections to be amended in the town zoning ordinance and the flood damage prevention ordinance. And as directed by council, town staff is proposing to amend the town zoning ordinance and the flood damage prevention ordinance to allow living space within accessory structures. The town council recently approved ZTA 1701, which established all previously permitted residential accessory structures containing living space as legally non-conforming as of January 1, 2017. Following that approval, the town council discussed and informally agreed that accessory structures with living space could be allowed as long as the living space in the accessory structures contribute to the maximum 6,000 square feet of enclosed space, living space that applies to single-family dwellings. So with respect to the zoning ordinance and the town staff version, there are 2 versions in your package. One that has highlights with the planning board's recommendations, not including what Chairperson Williams suggested tonight, but the original planning board recommended language. That is one version. The other version is the original town staff version. So that's what I'm referring to in this analysis. With respect to the zoning ordinance, the proposed language modifies the definition of dwelling unit, habitable space or habitable floors and stories, which is also known as living space, and establishes new definitions of enclosed living space, habitable space, and living space. The proposed language allows living space within accessory structures as defined in its new definition, and it prohibits dwelling units within accessory structures as defined in its modified definition. One example that would be in compliance with the proposed language is a detached garage with living space above. The living space would be allowed as long as it doesn't contain independent cooking and sleeping facilities, which would constitute a dwelling unit. With respect to the flood damage prevention ordinance, the proposed language would allow living space within accessory structures as long as it is above the regulatory flood elevation. In those cases, an elevation certificate would be required for all accessory structures that contain living space. With respect to the town's currently adopted land use plan, which contains the following goal and policy that are applicable to this ZTA, and that's policy number 2, that the community values in the town will continue to comply with the founder's original version of Southern Shores, a low-density residential community comprised of single-family dwellings on large lots served by a small commercial district for convenient shopping and services located at the southern end of town. This blueprint for land use naturally protects environmental resources and fragile areas by limiting development and growth. With respect to a recommendation, town staff and the town planning board have determined that the application is consistent with the town's currently adopted land use plan. And as Chairperson Williams indicated earlier, they did unanimously 4-0 recommend approval of this application with the modifications in yellow in your packets in their version at their September 18, 2017 meeting. If there are any questions, I can try to address those at this time. I know there were a few earlier. Yes, sir.
Could you outline the differences between the staff recommendations and the planning board recommendations so that we and everybody else can kind of understand where those differences lie and maybe similarities too?
Well, the chairperson earlier did make modifications to, or suggested modifications to, their original recommended language. If you go to their version, page 2 of 5, beginning on line 11 for the definition of dwelling unit, they had originally added to take out independent cooking and sleeping facilities and put in a stove and/or oven for a single family. So they, in their recommended language, they removed both. And tonight, as he discussed, there were some concerns with that. So what he is suggesting now is that it would read that "and containing stoves, ovens for a single family." They also removed the reference to habitable floors and stories, living space, which is on line 21, which is related to top plate language. I believe they felt that that was necessary. That could come out because the top plate height is no longer applicable. And the other change that they also instituted or recommended in their language on page 3 of 5 is Part 5, Section 36-202B3, which relates to the Sounds, Oceans, and Waterways zoning district. They decided to strike that out where an accessory structure with living space would not be allowed. There is no land in the OSW district, so I suppose it could apply to a boathouse or dock maybe, but there's no land in which there would be an accessory structure in that zoning district. So what I understand, based on what the chairperson has suggested tonight, the staff version would leave language sort of as it is with respect to independent cooking and sleeping facilities, not elaborating on what it is. So if you go to it, on the staff version, it's also on page 2. And you'll see that the dwelling unit definition only changes on lines 11 and 13. So what he did, or what they're suggesting, is that taking out, or if you are not allowed to have a stove or oven, or you can't have stove or ovens in dwelling units, but you can have them in accessory structures. That would be the difference. Whereas the staff version, in accessory structures, it says you can't have independent cooking and sleeping facilities, where it doesn't elaborate on what those independent cooking facilities are. Could it be a toaster? Could it be a microwave? Could it be a hot plate? I think that's what the planning board's trying to distinguish.
So I understand it, though, in the staff version, you can make arrangements to cook or have a kitchen, or you can have a bedroom. You can't do both.
It says if it's considered a dwelling unit if you do have independent cooking and sleeping facilities. So if you have both of those in an accessory structure, it would not be allowed per the town staff's recommended
Right,
language.
right.
Correct.
But you're allowed one dwelling unit per lot.
You could have one dwelling unit per lot, correct. And what staff is proposing is that it would be in the principal structure. The accessory structure can't contain a dwelling unit.
I see. So it's different than what you're saying, Tom. They can't have the range or the stove in that accessory structure.
Not if they want a bedroom, they can't.
So it's either or, in the
It's
accessory
either,
structure.
it says and, but it's applied as either or.
Whereas the planning board said you just can't have a stove no
They
matter
said
what.
stove or oven,
Stove or
so,
oven, no matter what. You just can't have it a specific stove or oven, no matter what. You could have a microwave.
Correct.
That's not identified.
correct.
But Wes, what you're saying, you can have sleeping quarters, is that correct?
It's like with the staff version, it's either or. Yes, sir. You could have sleeping
Okay.
and no cooking, or cooking and no sleeping is the way it's
Okay,
worded.
I understand.
Right, but you could have, yes, sir.
Okay, and if you do allow sleeping, that means those spaces could be rented out, correct?
Possibly, yes, sir.
Okay, that does not sound like that's in the spirit of our land use plan, which says low-density population, quiet. So why can't we take sleeping or cooking out of the ZTA and be more in accordance with what our use
could-
plan says?
We can certainly do that, yes, sir.
That would be my recommendation.
We can certainly do as the council wishes.
Okay.
Let me ask you a question, Wes. Are you talking about, when you talk about accessory structure, you're talking about an independent structure? Or
Yes.
one that's within the house?
In most cases, you're thinking of a detached structure.
Because we have houses that have multiple floors, that have multiple living spaces that are independent of each other,
Right, and
and they're rented.
you have to look at the definition of dwelling unit to see if it violates that. That's correct. Yes, it could be within a structure,
And
but
they have stoves and they have refrigerators
Right.
on multiple floors.
But, you know,
And I'm just,
Yeah, no,
my
you're good.
question is, how do you control that if you want to deny it? Because, I mean, we have those.
we would have to look, you have to look at the plans and see what's submitted, what they're proposing. If it's in compliance, you approve it. What happens later for things they do without a permit or without our knowledge, it happens.
So currently, do we have a limitation on, I know some localities have a limitation on the amount of, let's say, ranges or stoves within a lot? Meaning whether that designates it as a dwelling unit or whatever. Some towns, that's how they'll use that, or counties will use that to say, this is, you can't rent it to an individual long-term because they couldn't cook there, let's say. Do we have anything like that?
What we have now currently is the definition of dwelling unit, which contains the language independent cooking and sleeping facilities for a single family.
So if you had Gary's situation where you, one on top of each other, one
You could
side
have,
of each other,
you could
that would not be
have,
allowed.
you could have two stoves in a house. I mean, it depends on how it's all oriented and set up based on the definition of dwelling unit.
Okay. So that would be permitted?
I'm assuming.
Yeah, that's what I'm
That's
trying
what
to.
that's what I'm asking.
Yeah. So it's currently permitted now?
You can't have two dwelling units, but it's possible to have living space within the same principal structure, yeah.
That doesn't, you could have every.
And what was grandfathered earlier was for accessory structures that contain living space,
Yes.
previously permitted, and now we're trying to address if we want to allow it in the future. And, I mean, these are all very good questions. I mean, this certainly can be readdressed, and your concerns can be addressed. I mean, if it's something that you want us to look at, or the planning board to look at, it's up to you.
I have no trouble with this. I have no trouble saying if you want to put if you have lot size and enough square footage left to want to put an accessory living area over a garage, a carport, as long as you don't you make up your own mind, you want to sleep there or you want to eat there, and if we can enforce that, which is other issue, but I have no problem with that being allowed, either a kitchen and a stove they might need, and or a sleeping area with a shower, obviously. I don't object to that. I don't see any reason to
And then
question that.
Sorry to interrupt, in those situations that came up earlier, like parking, yeah, I mean, it would all come down to the septic capacity for the property. If they're increasing septic capacity in addition to what the home has, then yes, they'll be required to meet additional parking requirements based on the formula. And then also what's restrictive would be their lot coverage. If they're at 29%, obviously they can't add a detached structure. And they also have setback requirements to meet as well.
Well, Wes, shouldn't that be in these ZTAs, restrictions
They
on
would,
park?
I don't believe so. That already applies. The lot coverage, they still have to, without having to make any changes. It's a structure, therefore it has to meet lot coverage and setback requirements. And the parking.
Is it referenced that you must meet, I mean, I think I saw it in there in the planning board where it said all those apply. But anyway, shouldn't it be referenced that all other qualifications or all other things must be met, like the 6,000 square feet, the septic? Because, okay, so you can it have a bathroom?
It could, yes, sir. It
Okay.
could have a bathroom. And that would increase its septic
That
capacity.
increases your
and
septic. So
Therefore, they
our
may.
Your department monitors that. If they come for a building permit, they say they're going to put a bedroom there and a bathroom.
They first, upon submittal, they have to provide to us a permit from the Dare County Health Department approving their septic capacity, whether it's sufficient or not. That's a requirement upon submittal. We can't approve, we won't accept the application until we have that.
Right.
And can I add to that too? The enforcement question is a legitimate one. Typically, I've seen that come into play when people go to sell the home. And all of a sudden they're non-conforming and they're going to have to remedy that situation. So there's always going to be people out there who are trying to skirt the rules or whatever, but there is a point where it does come to roost if they're breaking the rules. Similarly, if lot coverage is the same thing. If people choose to cover more of their lot and they want to do something else in the future, then they have a problem, whether it be addition or something else. Also, the neighbors, if there is a significant problem where you start to see it in parking or otherwise, we've seen that in our neighborhood, then people will complain, and all of a sudden that misbehavior gets corrected fairly quickly. The other element regarding the land use policy, I mean, I'm not sure that this does violate our land use policy. This is fairly low density. We're not talking about a ton of bedrooms. We're talking about smaller spaces. We're still limiting the 6,000. I guess I would say that a big house has more impact on this low density question than having a bedroom over a garage. Whether people rent it out or not, they're already renting houses. They're already doing it. And we as a town have accepted that. So
I see it as being a positive from the perspective, if you have a younger couple who buy a modest home here, and then one of their parents comes to live with them, the parent would have a place to sleep separate from the primary home, but would still be able to take his meals with the family or her meals with the family. And I see that being a benefit to us as a community, to have a greater family be able to be on the same property. So I go back to what I said, I don't see any problem with this from the standpoint of land use or from the standpoint of just being honest about what goes on and trying to deal with it and say, let's make it possible. Thank you.
Yes, sir, thank you.
there's also communities that embrace this a little bit. There's one in Norfolk. East Beach is a very, very high-end community, and they allow for mother-in-law suites. And, you know, the property values are very high. It also allows folks to share, like families to share a property that would otherwise be not expensive, would be too expensive for the younger couple, or even the older person to be able to be in some proximity. We heard that from a fellow, I think he was on Hillcrest, I want to say. And that was his approach.
Yes.
He wants to build age in place. He wants to be able to
He was on Wax Myrtle.
Wax Myrtle.
Oh, Wax Myrtle, yeah.
Yep. He wants to be able to stay in Southern Shores.
Any other questions for Mr. Haskin? Thank you.
Just, it seems a lot of confusion's written into this. Do we need to take it back and rewrite it and clear up some of those questions before we move forward? I mean, it's not that I don't agree with it. What Tom said, if you got a aging parent that needs to come live with you, I can see that, that's fine. And however people want to use it, as long as they maintain it and that kind of thing, I don't have a problem with. But I just see a lot of questions and question marks on council, and even our planning chairman commented on that a little bit, that some of the things were not clear.
Well, actually, Wes, you're the one that has to administer it.
Yes, you are.
Now, can you administer it with the way everything's written here now, without any issues?
I mean, we can go back and look at it. We can do whatever council directs us to do.
Well,
Leo,
first of
and
all,
the
you
other
came
question
up
is-
with 2 recommendations.
We're presenting the staff version and the planning board version.
Well, y'all are at odds. Is there any way y'all can go back and work together?
And the other question I'd have, Leo, yours is a good question, would be, can a builder interpret what we're doing here when he comes to read the code and figure out what he's going to have to build for somebody?
Yeah.
I could work with either or. I think the planning board version with the modifications Chairperson Williams indicated would be easier, or it's a little more clarified with a stove or oven. The independent cooking facilities, that's a question that could always come up, and that might be a problem for enforcement. I mean, somebody could call and say, these folks have a hot plate in their kitchen area. I mean, it could go either way, honestly. Whatever you all prefer.
I'd prefer to make a decision, but it's going to be up to all of us to work together to reach that decision. I think the town version the staff version is probably the least complex. It says if you want to cook, you can. If you want to sleep, you can, but you can't do both in the same space.
Are you comfortable with that language?
That's pretty cut and dry.
Language in the enforcement side of it?
We can work with whatever, yes, sir, we could work with that.
Okay.
Let's be realistic here. The enforcement part it's like we become bedroom police, and I'm not sure the town staff's going to be able to really spend the time doing that. But you got to trust people. If they apply for something and they do what they applied for, you figure they're going to honor that agreement. You don't know what they're going to do in the future.
If it's in compliance with the ordinance, it's approved, and should we receive a complaint, we would investigate the
Yes,
complaint.
it would be complaint driven though.
Yeah, well,
Thank
like
you.
most of our ordinances are complaint driven.
But also that, if there is a complaint, everything, particularly in some of these rentals, are all online. And there's tons of pictures, so it's
Oh, yeah, that's an easy part.
fairly easy to research if there is a complaint.
But saying that, most of our complaints are,
Most of our ordinances end up being
Most
complaint
of them
driven
are
because
complaint
we
driven.
don't have,
my
we don't have a staff that
interpretation.
has nothing else to do other than drive around looking for all this information.
Well, and I know, and my question is, Leo, would be, my interpretation may be one thing, and Wes's may be another, and I mean, how you interpret this,
Well,
we could end up, I don't want to stand up fighting that battle in court or doing something where we end up having to rewrite it anyway.
That's what we got him for to do, because he's going to, if we have to stand up in court, he's the one that's going to have to defend us.
Well, another thing, based on your comments, Tom, I don't see how this satisfies a mother-in-law suite, because you either sleep or you cook. You can't do both. So it's not going to satisfy that. What's the point?
Well, it's on the same property, and mother-in-law could come have dinner with her family or breakfast, whatever, and then go back and have a place to live and a place to
No,
sleep, a
that's
place to
true.
read. That's how I was looking at it. I wasn't,
true.
Which some of us do now.
They would have some privacy.
I'm going to just interject one thing. Mr. Gallup helped to draft this document, if I'm not mistaken, the town version.
What I drafted was what came to you at the last meeting, which is essentially the staff's version of what went to the planning board. I don't think that there were any major changes from what I drafted. What we're getting hung up on tonight is the dwelling unit term. The dwelling unit term wasn't what was being approached from the initial drafting. the initial drafting was taking the assumption that the 20-something, 30-something, however year-old term for dwelling unit was okay with what the town wanted for a dwelling unit, and was just considering the living space issue above accessory structures. What's interesting about dwelling unit, when you look at it, is it's, as it's spelled out currently, it's not just sleeping facilities, but the best way to look at it is to take it as kind of a checklist. You gotta have one or more rooms or living spaces connected together, constituting a separate independent housekeeping establishment for owner occupancy or rental or lease, and physically separated from other rooms, living space, or dwelling units which may be in the same structure, and containing independent cooking and sleeping facilities. So if you put all those in a checklist and you check each box, you got a dwelling unit. If you leave off number 4, it's not a dwelling unit. It's not disallowed. I think the intent of the dwelling unit concept is to avoid multifamily usage of single-family homes. And the way you have multifamily usage of single-family homes is have a separate area, spelled out pretty much how this is. You can adjust this to some degree, and I think the reality is you could end up adjusting it yay or nay, this or that way forever, and never encompass everything you want, or would always knock something off that you did or didn't want. It's a very hard thing, that trying to think through it of a way to get it perfect. This may be as good as it gets. This is what a similar definition, if not the same definition, that a lot of towns use. But I think what you're trying to get there is that this is a separate enough area of your property that someone would let someone they had no earthly idea who they were completely live there. And that's a little different from the Airbnb concept of a one-night rental. I mean, if you look at Airbnb, people are renting their couches. So that's clearly not going to be a dwelling unit. It's going to be within a dwelling unit. That's a different beast that is a concept that is beyond this concept. The dwelling unit concept is trying to say, and one way to think about it, I guess, is forget about the accessory structures. Let's go back to today, before we change anything about accessory structures. Right now, you can't have any living space in an accessory structure, so you clearly can't have a dwelling unit because you can't have living space. We're good. Let's just look at a primary structure. Primary structure today can only have one dwelling unit if it's a single-family primary structure. But the way it's defined is how you determine if that upstairs, if it's completely separated, if it's, got independent housekeeping establishment, cooking, sleeping, physically separated, and is made for an owner or someone else to live in, then that's a dwelling unit that's not allowed. And what you're now doing is saying that can you have that over here? I see living space as conceptually, you're just putting a room at a house that's separated by some space that's a separate, airspace. But it's still a room to this principal structure, essentially. But a dwelling unit is an apartment, a condo, another principal house-type structure where someone else can completely live. But getting back to the definition, like I said, there's 6 or 7 things in the checklist. If you knock one of them off there, it can be pretty darn close to a dwelling unit, but not be one. And by not allowing any living space out there, it doesn't matter. But by allowing living space out there, you now have to consider whether or not that living space reaches the level of a dwelling unit. And the question, I think, that's kind of sitting in the room is, do you want to try and redefine dwelling unit to capture something different than what dwelling unit captures as it sits today? And I think what Wes was trying to get at when you ask him whether or not he can enforce it, you can enforce it however it's written, but it's a question of is the enforcement and how it's written what the policy you want it to be? Is what ultimately gets enforced and what is written the dwelling unit as you want it defined? And I think that there are many, many, many ways to potentially try and define a dwelling unit. And some may be better than what we have, some may not be as good. All of them are going to shift and have some area, it's all going to be some subset of what you want or some overlap into an area where you wanted something to happen and couldn't do it if you define it a certain way. I think it's just going to be a moving target. But glad to move the target if you want me to, and I'm sure Mr. Haskett is as well.
Any other questions, Council?
Is there any public comment?
Yeah, there is. And I think, before y'all make a decision on whether to send it back or to change things or to adopt anything, probably best to go ahead and hear from the public unless you have more questions for Mr.
I have
Haskett.
one more for Wes. Your version and the planning board, they removed the habitable floors and stories.
Yes, we would be okay with that.
Would you remove that from yours?
Yes.
I'm just saying they took it out because top plate no longer applies.
We would have no problem with that part of the recommendation, yes, sir.
You know what I'm asking, Mr. Ben? Susan,
Do I understand?
you know where I'm at?
I understand what you're asking. My only question would be whether or not habitable floors and stories is used somewhere else in the code without, it goes, just because the word top plate's in it, I'd rather strike the top plate than,
That's what I'm thinking.
than take it all away, if it's used other places in the code, but I'd have to look. I left it in. I'm assuming that if I left it in, it was probably used somewhere else in the code.
So strike out.
But recall though, I did draft it coming into the meeting where you dropped the language about top plate. So that would not have been in my thought process to have dropped the top plate at that.
Just a question.
You
That was just
considered that.
another question. It's kind of a conflict of the language.
Any other questions for Mr. Haskett?
I think we've beat it long enough.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Rasko, did you have something to say?
No.
First public comment is, the only person signed up is Mr. Martin.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor. Good evening, Council. About a year ago, had a client approach me on Wax Myrtle, bought a 1,400 square foot beach box on pilings with a two-car garage underneath of it. This room is the lot. You pull off the street there, you climb 20 feet from there to the back side of the lot, so you've got 4 quadrants here. He comes in and he turns this way. House sits here, septic system is over in the corner, huge oak tree, bunch of other trees through here. He can't get his van in his carport, in his garage, so he wants to build a detached garage. Through the course of that discussion, well, I refinish furniture, I do this, piddle around, tinker here, I'd like to have some heated space in there. Well, the only way you can get that is we'll put it up on top of it. So we've got basically these 2 quadrants with the house, small house, 1,400 feet, not a 6,000 square foot house. And we're gonna attach the 2 at the corner by a deck, because that's what everybody else has been permitted through over the years when we've sat here and talked about all this stuff. So designed it, they spent a little over about $2,800 in design fees. Took it to the engineer, he sealed it, $500. Took it to the health department, $525, approved. ARB, approved. Took it to West, can't do it. Looking back through the ordinances, when we created the 6,000 square foot restriction, we found this issue, that we are not supposed to have been permitting that. And that goes back into some history of who was doing what whenever. I don't want to get into weeds and all that. I just know that one of our residents, this client, has spent $3,500 and can't do this job. So I brought it to the town's attention, and we've been talking about it. And then you made some recommendations a couple months ago about grandfathering those structures. So I think that was all well and good. Attended the planning board meeting last month, and basically the discussion out of that is, it's kind of complicated, but it's not. You have one lot. You have a principal structure on that lot, a house, think about it in simple terms, a house with a kitchen and a stove. You can't have another house with a kitchen and a stove in it. So you have to take your pick. Do you want the big house, or do you want the accessory structure with the stove? One's got to give. Can't have it in both. So that eliminates a lot of the problems. Well, somebody's going to rent this out as an apartment. No, they can't, because they can't have the stove in it. Well, maybe they can, but they're not going to be able to cook there. So that was in this discussion and part of what the language was in front of you. You could put a bedroom in there or 2 bedrooms in there. But in order to do that, you still have to comply with the health restrictions, get a permit from Dare County. If anything kicked in on parking, that Wes would make you conform to that. Lot coverage was still an issue. You couldn't change anything on lot coverage. It still had to be 30%. So as long as you fit, and the 6,000 square foot, as long as you fit all the other criteria, you could do this. So it's not as complicated as it seems on paper. I mean, I've read that thing 5 or 6 times right now, and it just makes your head spin. But to me, that was the intent, that you couldn't go rent it out. You could have your mother-in-law, father-in-law stay there. They come and have dinner at the main house with everybody at dinner or whatever, something like that. So, and that's why I supported the ordinance language. So, but that, with that intent. So I think that's what this says. But I mean, back to Gary's point, Tom, I mean, you might need to tweak it a little bit, and I think you can do that tonight by making a couple of changes.
Thank you. Mr. Martin, is there anyone else who would like to speak to this? I'm going to get Ms. Radomski first.
Hi, Johnny Radomski at 40 Juniper Trail. I just want to say something about what Chris said about East Beach and Ocean View. I come from that area. My sister's a real estate agent there. They don't call them mother-in-law suites. They call them coach houses. They have complete kitchens. I've been in many of them. They're rented for thousands and thousands of dollars. So they do have a living space, a sleeping space, and a kitchen. So I just wanted to make that correction for you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am. And if you could state your, I don't know if I asked everyone else to do it, but if you could state your name and address, please.
Hi, I'm Joanne McCallum, 136 Oyster Bed Lane. I am a new property owner in Southern Shores, and I'm really tickled to see the proceedings tonight. Really appreciate the transparency. Really helps me. There's no dwelling on that lot yet, and I was very excited. I was out there with my builder. But he asked me to please come tonight because I'm a little bit of doing a head scratch. I think we're going to be okay based on what I thought I heard tonight. But I'd like to have an approval to have that living area over a garage connected by a breezeway. It's not clear to me, though, if in the time frame we want to commence, whether or not I'm going to get approved, or actually my builder would get approved. So I'm just asking you all to, if you haven't considered that yet, please, I'd appreciate you considering that question. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak to this public hearing?
No.
Can't see who it is, but yes, sir.
My name is Mark Prager. How you doing, Mr. Mayor and Council? It's my first time here. We've owned for 4 years, but we're permanent members now, and we're very proud of being here. I just have a question. What I don't understand, and I know maybe this is in the book, I didn't get a page and everything, but what I don't understand, and so we're trying not to have rentals in these extra apartments. Is that the main goal? Or just not to have any people in there?
I'll try and explain it. I think that the concept is to have some ability to live there, but not have the ability for a separate single family to live there for an extended period of time. That's currently where the concept is, but that concept could be adjusted or changed depending on the policy visions of the
I'm not
council.
here to say yay or, I mean, I'm just asking, but the new houses they're building on the ocean, you know, a lot of them are smaller lots. They all have gigantic garages, like with 3 or 4 bedrooms and kitchens. And they were built, I mean, the one by the Southern Shores on Hillcrest was built recently, and they're building another one there. And so how did they end up having a kitchen and bedrooms?
And there's about 6 meetings worth of history on that. But essentially, there were some mistakes made in the past, and that they were adjusted in, I believe, January. There was an ordinance adopted that, or since January, there's been an ordinance adopted that allowed those, but now the question is how to deal with going forward.
That was just my question. We used to hang out in the Jersey Shore too, and some towns you were allowed to do it, but almost every town in New Jersey you're not allowed to do it. I mean, that was to bring out, you know, the quietness keep the quietness of the town and stuff like that. That's all I was just wondering. So I just wondered how they got to do it, and some of the people haven't been able to do it. You know.
I think our intent is to limit that, that ability to have a separate dwelling, a separate living dwelling with all the amenities you have to have
Sure.
being there. And then not just to discourage the rental potential, but don't have 2 homes occupying the same lot, 2 completely habitable homes.
Yeah, I understand that a lot of people would probably like to have, you know, like whether it's a mother or a mother-in-law or a child or even a grandparent, you know, live next to them. I mean, things are tough for some of the people, and it's, you know, it does help out, you know, like the elderly people. A long time, we used to have all the elderlies live with us, and now we shove them off to the nursing homes, which are outrageously priced. But look, I just was curious to see what the point was. But, you know, hey, I'm really happy with whatever goes on here. I mean, it's an unbelievable place. It really is. I mean, you really get to appreciate it when you move from New Jersey. That's for sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and welcome both of you to the meeting tonight. The rest of y'all have been here, are getting to be veterans.
Regulars.
Is there anyone else who would like to speak to this public hearing? Not seeing anyone, Mr. Mayor, I'll close the public hearing.
Thank you, Ben.
And, Mr. Mayor, may I address one thing that's come up a couple of times?
Absolutely.
The question about whether or not when an accessory building is an accessory building and not part of the principal structure. Your definitions essentially separated by an accessory building means a subordinate building consisting of walls and a roof, the use of which is clearly incidental to that of the principal building, even where the accessory building is attached to the principal structure by breezeways, covered walkways, or other structures that do not constitute living space. So in Southern Shores, it's an accessory building if it doesn't have air-conditioned space between the 2 structures. So if you had an air-conditioned breezeway, it's going to be part of that principal structure. But if it's just a covered walkway, or any other kind of breezeway, or if it's completely separate, then it's a detached dwelling. A detached accessory building is what the definition is. So that's come up in a couple of different comments, and I think that's...
So you're saying with this ZTA, there is no requirement for there to be a connection between the main living space and the accessory building?
Correct, because it's not an accessory building if that connection is there. It's part of the principal structure. And I think some of that had come up in the past. Currituck's ordinance is a little different on how it defines a building, and there was a case about that, but it does not define the building the same way that Southern Shores defines a building.
Is that included in this ZTA? Does it explain that?
No, this is a common issue also that, something else I noticed, but this is a common issue that comes up is what you see as a ZTA is just the minimal amount of what you're going to change in the ordinance that's, hundreds of pages thick. So there's a tendency to want to have the ZTA itself to be able to look at it and understand everything related to how a property is going to be affected. But the concept is that if it's not in there, it's not changing how it's affected. And I think that's how Mr. Haskett relayed the bedroom and parking question. The parking question is driven off the septic permits rather than the living space requirement. So while if you put it in here while you're looking at it, it helps us understand it to make the decision. Once you put it back in the ordinance, you've now added another paragraph that is actually probably going to ultimately be confusing, because someone's going to have to figure out, well, why was that added here? What does that mean about over there? And then when someone changes that parking requirement, they're going to have to find the spot where you referenced it to and change that. So it, over time, cross-referencing everything that might make it easier to understand at the time you're adopting it ultimately causes considerably more confusion and complexity. That's just something that I've observed over the time that I've been doing this.
And not to confuse this any more than I have to, but you have to recognize that the town has certain rules and certain policies and certain regulations, but you also have a civic association and a CPOA that have separate rules and regulations. So I know from experience that you could have an attached structure on some properties in Southern Shores, but it had to be connected to the primary residence, to the primary house. So you also got to comply with those rules. And normally it's not a big issue, but just to be aware of that. We've closed the public hearing. Council, what's your pleasure? I would entertain a motion. If someone has one to make. Chris, you have any thoughts on this?
I guess, Gary, did you?
Go ahead.
I'm comfortable, I guess I'm most comfortable with Wes's version of it, with some minor tweaks, and there were some tweaks we talked about, and I think you've got a few too. But I think I like Wes's version, where it's a kind of a binary choice. You can have that the stove or the bedroom, but you can't in that accessory structure. But you can't necessarily have both. What that does is it stops those long-term rentals, which is, I appreciate your comments. It would differentiate from that product, so you wouldn't have a long-term rental. There would, you couldn't sleep there. It would just be, so picture a cabana, and that's just for lack of a better thing, where there might be a stove there. But whereas there'd be no sleeping. So I guess I'm comfortable with that. I'm not distinctly opposed to the planning board, but I think that's my preference.
So what's your motion?
I think,
But I'd like to maybe discuss it a
I
little.
think we've got some language that needs to be clarified.
Okay.
I think we all agree with that. And I don't know exactly, like, strike out located below the top plate.
Well, that's a low-hanging fruit one there.
So, and I guess we need to check and see if it's referenced somewhere else.
We would, I mean, I wouldn't want to drop the definition if it was necessary.
Right.
To some other portion of the code. And one thing that I would caution is if you're not going to adopt the planning board, if someone's not making a motion to adopt the planning board version, the staff version included some concepts for how to address and tie it to the square footage. But it does not include an adoptable version of how to do that. Whereas, so what you would want to do is modify the plan. Say if you wanted to use the original dwelling unit language, you would make a motion to adopt the planning board with the original dwelling unit language of the staff presentation, and go from there.
Yeah, but why wouldn't we just send it back and have it come back with that language instead of playing what-if games?
You could do that as well. It's up to you how you want to do that.
I tell you what, I've read this, and I'm like Mark out there. I've read it 5 or 6 times. I tell you, it's so confusing. If we could come back with one version that, plain English that people can understand would really be helpful.
I don't know if you'll ever arrive at that one.
What's that?
I don't know if you'll arrive at one
never
in
gonna
plain
get to plain
English.
But nonetheless, I think you're right in that we're kind of jumbled a little.
So
Well, we're confusing ourselves some, I think. I think if you just think of it as a, if it has a bedroom and it has a shower, it can't have a kitchen and qualify. If it has a kitchen and a bathroom, it can't have a bedroom. And that's pretty basic. I don't think that's too complicated.
I know it's
Now,
basic, and I understand the concept. I'm not arguing that. I'm arguing the ZTA doesn't say that. The staff version needs to be rewritten to conform to the legalese, I guess, that Ben's recommending to us and get it all in a consistent language.
Could we all agree on a conceptual framework and then ask staff to rewrite it based on that conceptual framework?
Yeah, I'd like to get this behind us.
I'd like to see it come back in a form that we can understand and vote on. Because we just keep jumping back and forth, and it's confusing.
I agree with you, and conceptually, we've got what we want, I think, but there's parts in one that need to be in the other, and there's parts in the
Exactly.
other that needs to
But-
be corrected according to what I heard Chris say. He likes the one, but it doesn't have the
Okay.
planning board's part, and I don't want to be sitting up here switching things in or out. So should we ask them, and I like your idea of give them the direction of,
Ben, let me ask you a quick question. What do you need from us that you don't already have?
Wes?
Wes, I'm sorry. Did I call you Ben again?
Yes.
I
Thank
apologize.
you. Thank you. I'm glad to have been confused with Wes. I'm sorry, Wes.
We have, like I said, there are two versions. You can blend the two, you can use one, you can use the other, send it to the planning board, and they can work on it, and staff can work on it. It's your preference.
Do you need more specific direction you've gotten tonight from us? 'Cause I don't think you've gotten things that are really concrete.
You all need to make a motion to send it back to the line.
Okay.
I think we can probably do the language smithing if we wanted to.
Gentlemen, I'd make a motion that we send this back to the planning board for further consideration and to bring it back to us at a certain time.
We need to come
But can we
back.
vote,
Tom.
there are two directions in this. Can we give them some direction as a group, which we choose? One, correct me if I'm wrong, Sam, but in Sam's direction, there was no cooking whatsoever in that accessory unit.
No, you have a hot plate.
Well, yes, but sorry, I take that back. No oven or oven in that accessory structure. In the staff's one, there was a distinction between, it was an either or.
Yeah.
So can we as a group give a preference? What do we all think of this? That way, when they go back, they're going to come back with language that matches what we're hoping for. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
So
I agree.
so what's your preference on that?
I like kind of like the either or.
Yeah, I do too.
So you like
Gives
the one
gives
out
them
of the-
flexibility
Out
to it.
of the staff version.
I like that out of the staff version,
got
but there's
that,
some
Wes?
good language that planning board added to.
Well,
The area I would tell you that I would like for you to work on would be, I like the planning board's version, instead of the options on lot space or on lots where living space count toward, do it like I think the planning board, let's see, that's
Well-
page 3.
well,
And if we want, we can go back, can we have Ben write it up or staff write it up?
my thoughts on, we need to come back with one.
We can make them. I don't mind making them. If we're that close, Gary, just
I
make
mean-
them. Let's be done with it.
This is not a
Let's just be done
cafeteria,
with
let's
it.
get
If
it
we're that
done.
close.
Send it back, let them write, because they got to take some of
No.
the stuff out.
No.
Mr.
Gentlemen,
Mayor.
my opinion is, if we send it back, we need to give them direction to come back with one,
Yes, yes.
not
yes.
two. Then it's
And not
easy,
options.
then it's easy to work with, no option.
No options.
Excuse me.
Because as soon as you give an option, you're going to have trouble, and we just had it right here.
This thing needs to be.
Just a suggestion, if the council wants it to come back, and you've given direction as to how you want it tonight, I'd recommend you ask the town attorney, does that have to go back to the planning board, or can it come back from just staff? it's going to be a time difference.
Yeah, let's come back from staff.
I don't know. Yeah, that's up to,
The changes you're talking about making, it has to go back to the planning board if you're making a change that's substantial enough that someone who was coming, who saw the notice of this meeting and saw the information about this meeting, they would have come if you were making a change that was that different. What you're talking about is changes between two versions that are both being presented at the meeting. I don't think you would have to send it back to the planning board. I think you could take it up at another meeting with those changes drafted in without the law requiring you to. However, you completely end the risk of whether or not someone could challenge it for not going back to the planning board by sending it back to the planning board. I think your risk is very limited, but it's absolutely zero if you send it back to them.
Yeah. And you're the one who's got to defend us.
send it back to planning board.
And I think that's what the motion is already on the table to do that.
With, can we keep?
Tom made the motion, I second.
I made a motion to send it back to the planning board.
Okay.
Okay, second that motion. Is there any further discussion?
Can we,
No,
with the direction, can we send it back to the planning board with the direction of what?
Is it fair to say that what I'm hearing is maybe the easiest way is to look at the planning board version and kind of step through it? And what I'm seeing on the planning board version on page 2 of 5, where it's yellow, is that instead of just the concept of the stove or oven, you want to leave the stove or oven, but have an either or of sleeping facilities.
There you go.
All right. So then we can step to the next yellow, which is the other difference between this one and the staff version. And you don't want to strike habitable floors and stories if it's used somewhere else, but you are fine with striking the concept of the top plate that's in that definition. Is that correct?
Yeah,
Correct.
and I'm fine with striking.
And striking it
floors
if it's not used somewhere, if it's used,
somewhere else.
okay. So we're all good on that?
Yeah.
Right.
All right.
I mean,
And then on the next
This
page,
is very
we're
helpful.
there.
on page 3 of 5, I think everybody was okay with the striking of lines 6 through 10. Because you couldn't have, you wouldn't be able to fit a customary accessory structure in that area.
Yeah.
And then part 6 is the other, it's not in yellow, but it's on page 3 of 5, lines 15 through 17. That's the portion that takes care of the options that are in the staff. I think everybody is okay with that. Is that correct? That's the portion that says it applies to the living space.
Right.
Okay. So if everybody's by consensus okay with those changes, I think between myself, Wes, and the planning board, we can make those changes and bring it back to you after the planning board takes a quick look at it.
Is there,
That's the 6,000 square feet.
So,
So we'll,
You know, they might
if there's
want
consensus,
6,000
Mr. Mayor, we'll record that motion with those with those additions to the motion, if there's consensus.
Anyways, I'm gonna trust Ben on that. Let's not muck it up.
okay.
They gotta do it anyways.
there you go.
So my motion is we send it back to the planning board with those changes that were just recommended by Ben.
I second.
And you've already seconded that. Any further discussion, council?
Nope.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Wow. We've still got a number of things to cover. I'm going to ask for a 10-minute recess. We'll come right back in 10 minutes.
Tell them getting older.
Do we got to introduce anybody on the
Meeting's reconvened. We're going to address item 9, a public hearing, purpose to consider LDA 17-01, a landmark designation application submitted by Courtney Clements to designate 23 Porpoise Run as an historic landmark. Tab 4 in your book, council. Ben, would you take over the public hearing for me, please?
Yes, sir.
Crowd thinned out.
We're going to open the public hearing for the consideration of LDA 1701, landmark designation for 23 Porpoise Run as a historic landmark. As with the last one, we'll have Mr. Haskett give a brief presentation, and then we will go through the list of people who signed up, which is no one, and I will ask for hands for anyone else who wishes to speak at the public comment. Mr. Haskett.
Thank you again, Ben.
Yes, sir.
Good evening again, Mayor and members of council. The next item on your agenda is a public hearing for 23 Porpoise Run. The application is LDA-1701. Property is located at 23 Porpoise Run. The current property owner is Courtney W. Clements. And the appraised value, according to Dare County tax records, the property is $307,700, which includes the house and the 1,500 square foot parcel. The tax appraisal for the house alone is $51,400, and the land is appraised at $256,300. The 23 Porpoise Run house, also known as the Sokol House, constructed in 1958 in Southern Shores, is a prime example of the flat top inspiration that Frank Stick brought to Dare County in the late 1940s. Around 25 flat-top homes remain in the town today. In 1958, 23 Porpoise Run was developed. The flat-top roof design was inspired by pre-existing properties by Mr. Stick. The property represents Mr. Stick's original design, including the adopted overhang and whitewashed exterior that Mr. Stick added to his previous Florida inspiration. In April 2000, the current owner of the home added an addition to the east side of the home. This addition included a kitchen and laundry room, screen porch, which also faces the east side. Through this renovation, the exterior of the home was made to look like the pre-existing structure, including an overhang and whitewashed exterior color that still stands today. These are excerpts from the report that was included in your packets. It was prepared by Kellen Long, our planning intern, if you remember, we had during the summer. She's gone back to school. She did a great job preparing this report, as well as another, which may be coming to you soon. So if there are any questions from the report, I'll try to answer those for you. As Chairperson Whitley indicated earlier, the Historic Landmarks Commission recommended designation of this application at their July 25th meeting. If you look up on the screens, you'll see, we'll just go through a few of the photos. This is the front view of the home, 23 Porpoise Run. This is the west side view, rear view, the other rear view, and this is from the other side, which shows the porch addition, facing from the east side, and this shows it a little closer right there. Also included in your packet is a letter from the State Historic Preservation Office. As required by our ordinance, they have to comment on all applications. And they did include in their letter from Amber Kidd that they do recognize that it is a potentially historic landmark. They are in favor of designating it as a historic landmark. If there are any questions, I can try to answer those for you. I'm not sure. I don't believe the applicant is present or a representative of the applicant, but I can try to answer questions that may come up.
Does anybody have any questions for Mr. Haskett?
Yeah, I got a couple for clarification on my own. Does this classification stay with the property in perpetuity?
It
or-
does. It runs with the property.
So if it's sold in another,
They would be subject to, if they wanted to make changes to the exterior, they'd have to go through the certificate of appropriateness process.
okay. And then as I understand it, that the tax is like 50% then?
They do, if, once a property is designated, the owner is given a 50% tax reduction. That's correct.
That was mine.
The, what you'll see in the, also in your packet is a copy of the actual ordinance, and it addresses those issues as well. Any other questions?
Nope.
Thank you, Wes.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else who would like to speak at this public hearing? Is the applicant by chance, or anyone on the applicant's behalf here? Okay. Is there anyone else who'd like to speak at this public hearing? Just raise your hand. Seeing no one, Mr. Mayor, I'll close the public hearing and give it back to you.
Thank you, Ben. Council, I would make a motion that we grant this property, 23 Porpoise Run, as a historic landmark.
I'll second it.
Any further discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion is made and carried to grant 23 Porpoise Run, or to make 23 Porpoise Run a historic landmark. Thank you. Congratulations. Good job. Item B is to update the, update on preliminary new flood maps relative to Southern Shores Planning Department, tab 5. Ben, Wes, it's you again. I'll get it right a couple more years.
He's a busy guy tonight.
Ask Abby Shelton, other planning department employee, to come. We're going to both do this presentation. She's a certified flood zone manager, so
Thank
she's
you.
going to be participating as well.
Good evening, Mayor, Council. Tonight, we're going to give you a brief history, background on the current flood maps, the inshore rates maps for Dare County and the town of Southern Shores. They're dated September 20th of 2006. The new firms, the new preliminary flood maps were released on June 30th, 2016. And currently, there are 250 structures located in the VE flood zone. And on the preliminary maps, it's going down to 122, which is a difference of 28 properties. Those 128 properties are more than likely going into a shallow AO zone or an X zone. Currently, there are 1,035 structures in an AE flood zone. And on the preliminary maps, it's going down to 237 properties. And that's a difference of 798. And those, likewise, those vary. And the majority of those are going into the X zone as well. The preliminary flood maps are only available online. They're only in digital form, and they can be accessed by going to the FRIZ website. We are currently in our appeal period. The required 90-day appeal period began on August 16th of 2017, and it ends on November 13th. FEMA provides a 90-day appeal period during which time local jurisdictions and property owners can submit their scientific and technical data for any information that they feel where the flood maps are incorrect. And then local jurisdictions will have the opportunity to also weigh in on those appeals. They also have to provide supporting data submitted in the appeal process by a North Carolina licensed surveyor engineer. And we also will, will have the opportunity to gauge in and make our comments on those appeals.
What's that URL again?
It is, look at that. frizz.nc.gov.
Okay.
And that's also available on our website, on the town website too.
Thank you.
You're welcome. The local officials from Dare County, and that's the unincorporated planning staff as well as the other municipalities within the county. We've been meeting regularly since the preliminary flood maps were launched in June of 2016. And primarily, our discussion has been based on public awareness of historical flooding and property owners dropping flood insurance policies versus the potential flood claims and their impact on local, state, and federal levels. What we don't want is the false sense of safety that if you're in a flood zone now and the flood maps, the preliminary flood maps are removing you from a special flood hazard area and you drop your flood insurance, you still have the potential for loss of, damage. And those claims, if you don't carry flood insurance, they're going to come from other areas, whether it's local, state, or federal levels. And we want to also emphasize responsible building practices. And then we've been discussing developing higher regulatory standards for construction.
Additional concerns that we have with the preliminary maps are street addresses on the FRIS website are inaccurate when you're searching for and identifying properties. The map legends do not include labels for the shaded X zone or the X zone. All local jurisdictions should be involved in the initial stages of any future map development process. And it's worth noting that in February 2017, Spencer Rogers with the NCC grant program indicated in a presentation to the Dare County Board of Commissioners that the FEMA coastal flood model that was used in the development of these firms was outdated, and there are other more accurate models that exist. Additional concerns also that the AO zones are now included in Southern Shores, which are not currently there, and they reflect flooding resulting from overtopping of the primary dunes on the ocean front. The AO zones do not address shallow flooding from rainfall. As you recall, most of NC-12 and most of the avenues experienced significant flooding during Hermine and Matthew due to rainfall. Additional concerns, a significant number of properties are being removed from the special flood hazard areas into the shaded X or X zone. The Soundside AE zone base flood elevation is decreasing from 7 feet to 4 feet. With respect to that, we are reviewing options, as Dabney said earlier, for local elevation standards, which would attempt to maintain a similar or higher base flood elevation that we have now, closer to the 7 feet. We are concerned that many property owners may cancel their flood insurance coverage. That could result in higher rates if future maps revert back to the special flood hazard area or a higher base flood elevation. And local jurisdictions, since we've been meeting, are working on campaigns, slogans, working together, bumper stickers, a website, other information to promote that low risk is not no risk. That's what was the slogan that everyone agreed upon. So you may be seeing that information posted throughout town and everywhere else. With respect to next steps, Dare County and the other local jurisdictions, you received in your packets a copy of the letter that Dare County sent to the state and to FEMA addressing these concerns, these same concerns, with the preliminary flood maps, and we request that the town send a similar letter before this appeal period ends in November. The appeal period ends on November 13th, and once that's concluded, the state and FEMA will consider that or the information that's been submitted. And once all the appeals and comments have been addressed, there will be a 6-month adoption process for us to adopt the preliminary maps and update our local flood ordinance. A public workshop will be held prior to the end of the appeals period, so sometime in the next month or so, we're planning on scheduling a public workshop where we can maybe set up computers and have folks come in, if they haven't already, look to see what impacts their properties are subject to as a result of these new maps. We can show them how it works and where their property lies and answer any questions that they may have. So Just a couple of other additional resources are a few. There's the town website. We have an entire section that's dedicated to flood protection and information. The town's biweekly newsletter, we try to include as much information as we can about what's going on with the flood maps and any changes that may be coming up in there, as well as on the town's social media Facebook page. So in closing, we are requesting that we send a letter to the state, similar to the counties, that addresses these concerns. And if y'all have any questions at this point, we'd be glad to try to answer them.
The question I got, Spencer Rogers indicated there were other models that were apparently maybe potentially more accurate. Has anybody investigated that in the circle or tried to run anything against it to see if that is actually a good statement?
The other communities, well, I know I think some research has been done into it, but I don't know if anyone has agreed on a specific model. Now, I'm not aware of any.
Yeah, I mean, he makes that statement that there are other models that are more accurate, but which ones are they? And
We haven't done the research into which ones he specifically would suggest. I'm not sure if he gave that information during the presentation.
no, he didn't. He just said he made a broad brush statement but no definition of who those other models were and how they looked at it differently.
Correct.
That's all the question I had.
Wes, I was fortunate enough to attend a meeting in Nags Head about a month ago. Some of you may have been there, but it was well done. They had a speaker a scientist, who was one of the people who came up with one of the original models of how this whole thing would play out. And he was part of the team that did one phase of it. Of course, his work went on beyond that, and the final result, excuse me, of all this, when he admitted this, was not what he would have expected. He felt like there was a lot of critical information that was left out. Some of the storm events that have occurred even before this plan was presented were not included. The other thing that you mentioned, both of you mentioned, was the fact that they didn't give any consideration to rainwater. It was all the entire flood thing dealt with what the sound's going to do or what the ocean's going to do as far as overwash or water level rising. And there was no which he felt was a real serious omission, because there are some places that flood from rain, as we found out during Matthew. There were so many problematic things about this that he was kind of warning everyone to go back to your own town and look at what your reality is, what you've dealt with in the past, and put that into your mix as far as what you're going to require as far as building code changes, things like that. What you need from us is a letter, which I would suppose you would draft that for me to sign.
Yes, we could do that. Yes, sir.
If you would, I think council's in consensus that we do that. I mean, are we not?
No problem.
Because there are some serious issues with these new flood maps. There's no question about it. So if we would say go ahead and prepare the letter for signature. That's what else do you need?
That would do it.
Good report. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dabney.
Thank you.
The next item is item C under new business, consideration of the land use plan update proposals. Excuse me. Land use plan update proposals per adopted fiscal year 17-18 budget. Any comments on this, Peter?
These proposals and not bids, but proposals are listed from the planning department, from vendors who were interested in doing business in eastern North Carolina, and we bring them back to the council based on your previous conversations and our understanding that the council wanted to be involved in that selection. To further that, the principals of both of these firms have indicated they would come at council, upon the council's invitation, to present to you, and you can dialogue with the individuals at that time. If you don't want to do that, the staff is very familiar with at least one of these. The town planners are familiar with at least one of these vendors and the work they've done in eastern North Carolina. But this is the beginning of the process, and that's what we brought to you, and they've proposed what they've proposed. So, I would recommend that you consider directing us to invite both of them to come in and give presentations at a future meeting. if
That's
you'd
my
like to.
position.
And I have a motion I would make right now for that. I make a motion to have our town manager bring in the representative from each of these companies to address council at our November meeting or as soon thereafter as possible. Do I have a second?
Second.
Any further discussion?
Nope.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Motion's made and carried. So, Peter, we're asking you to go ahead and arrange for them to come here, both of them, and speak to us.
Let me ask you this, Peter. Are these the only firms that would be interested in doing this update?
They're the only two that have responded to the town's solicitation to give
So
proposals.
how did you solicit?
Wes, you want to elaborate on that?
Be advertised in December.
You're the man.
Good evening again. The memo I sent may not have been clear. We did a request for proposals. One that ran on the NC Plan listserv on July 20th, 2017. We received one response to that from Holland Consulting Planners. Being that we only had the one response, we figured we would run it again on the NC Plan listserv, which is a listserv customary for all the municipalities in the state to get information out to firms and the private sector as well. We posted it on the town's website as well. But we ran the first one July 20th, received one response. And so we ran the second on August 22nd, and that's when we received a response from InFocus. And that's why we're bringing these two now at this time.
Great.
But we figured we'd try to get at least more than one. We wanted more than one.
Is it worth continuing to advertise?
We can. I mean, we could do another solicit. We can post a copy of the proposal on the website and on the listserv one more time. It's up to you all.
Is that fair to the two folks who've responded?
No, I didn't get into fair. I just asked, is it worth doing a third advertisement? I personally don't think it's worth it, but I'm just asking Wes. He has more familiar than I am with this. I would. So we have a motion and a second to go ahead and have them come and visit with us. The two we already have. I think that's probably adequate. So, did we vote on that? We did.
Just voted.
We didn't vote.
We did. All right.
Let's vote on it.
All right. All in favor?
Aye.
All right. Thank you. Motion is made and carried. Have them
Thank
come
y'all.
and visit with us. Any more public comment, folks? Sheila? Is anybody left that wants to speak?
Tells us the story. Tells you the story.
Anybody have any comments?
Too long.
That's the vote. She would. Only got 4 people.
I'll close public comment. I only have one thing I'd like to add tonight. I don't want to keep you here any longer than we have to, but I just was able to attend the throwdown north of town, which took place on the south end of town this year, the surfing contest or tournament mostly for youth, and it was a great event. We had they moved the event from Chickahawk Beach down to our new beach near the Kitty Hawk Pier. I think it was their best participation ever, like 500 plus people there. The kids had a great time. They weren't just surfing, they were doing gymnastics and everything else out there, and it was fun to watch. As I said a minute ago, just a great event, and one that I think brings a lot of positive recognition to our town. That we had people from Ocracoke once again, and even further down the coast coming up for this event. Very good thing. Council members, let's start with Mr. Newberry.
I don't have any comments.
Thank you.
The only comment I got is I want to thank Peter and Bonnie for their efforts on the audit. I know Bonnie's not here, but she carries most of that load. And she works very hard at making sure we are in compliance on a day-to-day basis. So thank you again.
Keith, thank you, Leo. Gary, anything?
You got nothing?
You go if you want.
No, I was going to make a motion to go to closed session.
I was struck by something in Ms. Osborne's write-up, and I just thought this was really, I think speaks well to all of us here and to staff particularly. In the financial highlights, she says, at the close of the current fiscal year, Town of Southern Shores governmental funds reported combined ending fund balances of roughly $5 million, an increase of $688,000 roughly over the prior year. And I think that speaks volumes. I mean, what we're seeing here is good governance. And it's sometimes hard to see. But you hear a sentence like that, and that we're actually in the black is what we're hearing from that. And that's very, very positive. Not all towns are like that. Most towns are not like that. I know there's not many people here, but it's important to say to staff, hey, job well done. That's what we're supposed to be doing.
In the previous audits, we've consistently had that same statement.
Yeah. And then,
I mean, it's not just a blurb that we did it one year, it's been consistent. And that's the key.
That's it.
It's just confirming what a good job. Gary, do you want to make a motion?
Closed session.
Good. Motion to go to closed session. Council, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. We enter closed session at this time.